The final reading for this week is Edwin Black's The Second Persona. This is another classic of contemporary rhetorical theory. I did look up the Robert Scott information, and that one was 67, so it was a little later than I thought. And then Black's essay comes just a few years later, and it's 1970. So both of these are older than the Polakos piece, but I still like that one to set things up. And with Black, we're in similar terrain, although we're coming at things a little bit differently. Edwin Black wrote a number of really important essays in this period. He was a critic. Polakos is more of a theory guy. Scott, I don't know that his rest of his work so well, but that was a theory piece. Now, with Black, we're getting a discussion about criticism. Rhetorical criticism is something that we do as scholars of rhetoric. We can theorize rhetoric. We can talk about rhetoric in its historical context. There's a lot of criticism in that. Or we can sort of engage in actual criticism, which is the kind of the description and assessment and explanation and sort of evaluation or judgment of actual rhetoric. So here Black is, and again, he was known as a critic primarily, and a theorist of criticism, and that's what we're getting here is a piece of theory on what it means to be a rhetorical critic and how to do it. And he's zeroing in on this question of the second persona. And for lack of a better word, we can just think about that as ideology, although caution, right? I don't love talking about ideology because it's so invisible and gaseous and weird and everything. But we'll get to that in a sec. But this idea of the second persona is, for, the quickest way to kind of get there is to think about the image of the audience that is implied within the text itself, within the discourse. It's this kind of hidden code or set of assumptions that one can find within a text. And the kind of sum total of what he calls stylistic tokens and attitudes and so on, and this kind of the codes that are in the text give rise to a kind of persona, an image of the audience that is being implied by the text. It's basically saying, what Black is saying about the second persona is that it is a way for a speaker to kind of embed or imply a certain kind of audience that they're hoping is listening to this message, right? So it's an implied audience. It's implied within the text. So it's less about what's explicitly stated than what's implicitly stated, but the idea being that, again, the importance of style here, we talked about that with Polakos, that the stylistics within a text, the attitudes, the little interesting metaphors, and the kinds of examples that are used and so on, they kind of add up to a certain kind of attitude that it will be appealing to certain audiences and not others, essentially. And it's crafting a persona. It's saying you are the kind of people who will understand this. You are not the kind of people who will understand this. So the second persona is the audience, the image of the audience that is being embedded or implied within the text, essentially. All right. So I've just got 5, 6, 7 different kind of key moments in this text, and then I'll sort of draw attention to some of the key language as well. So we get half the piece, or a little bit more than half, is on kind of the theoretical discussion about the second persona, and then he goes in and gives an elongated example, and that's where he sort of turns into being the critic. This idea of the cancer of communism is his main example. We won't spend so much time on the example, but it's a good way to sort of think about what he's talking about. Anyway, so let's just kind of get through what he is saying about the second persona. First of all, he talks about the moral evaluation of criticism as an important job of the critic. We don't need to get too bogged down in sort of the nitty-gritty of what criticism is and isn't and so on, but basically saying it's the job of the critic to make judgments about texts, about speeches, about narratives, statements, policies, whatever. critic's job is to assess it morally. Now, you can actually connect that to what we were just learning about with Scott's Rhetoric as Epistemic. Don't forget that that was all about kind of these ethical guidelines, right? Well, if we're dealing with a world of uncertainties and we must act and we must will our way forward, then it stands to reason that we can be judged by critics for those decisions, for the texts we create, for the statements and utterances and so on, right? And so Black's kind of giving us the latter portion of that discussion that Scott kicks off. And so he thinks it's important that, and he actually says, he's such a writer. He loves writing. You can tell he just loves to hear himself write. This idea of critics fulfilling their duty to history, right? He says this in the second column on the first page. The judicial phase of criticism, he means the judgment phase, the evaluation phase, is a way of bringing order to our history, right? So we as critics are creating order when we're, offering moral judgments of speeches and so on. We are the ones who are trying to create a sense of continuity and clarity in terms of all the stuff that gets churned out there. He says it is through moral judgments that we sort out the past. So he's giving quite the esteemed position to the critic here. Now, from there, he moves on to the moral implications of discourse, of speech in particular. And he says something quite powerful, I think. This is one of the biggest moments in this essay. He talks about the symptomatic function of discourse. This is on 109 already? No, it's 110, I believe. Sorry, I'm just looking for here. Yeah, so left column, 110, the bottom there, he says, I propose exploring the hypothesis that if students of communication could more proficiently explicate the saliently human dimension of discourse, if we could, in a sense, discover for complex blah, 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 we should then be able to subsume the discourse. Sorry, that's just a kind of thesis statement for the essay. Next column. We are still inclined to recognize, as our predecessors have for many centuries, that language has a symptomatic function. There it is. Symptomatic. In the sense that it creates certain kinds of effects that go beyond just the words themselves, right? And he says, language has a symptomatic function. Discourses contain tokens of their authors. That's key. Tokens of their authors. And then he continues, discourses are directly or in a transmuted form the external sign of internal states. So he's beginning to get at this idea that speeches contain more in them than sort of more than they seem. This idea of discourses containing tokens of their authors. If you know anyone really well, like a loved one or something, then you know that they have certain kind of patterns, right? Certain ways of saying things or moving or leaning or standing or certain tones or whatever. Like we all have our kind of unique sort of quirks and idiosyncrasies. And it's usually when we get to know each other really well that we get a handle on those little quirks. I think that's the idea here, is that in a given speech or text or whatever, there's going to be quirks. There's going to be tokens of the author that are unique and revealing. Right? And a lot of times these tokens, like when we're doing our little noises or scratching or whatever, or we have our little tics, we're not like consciously doing these things. I have all kinds of friends who like have interesting kind of throat clearing. I do that a lot myself. Like we all have our stuff, right? Well, now think about the sort of the speech itself. And sure enough, like any given speaker or auditor will have tokens, will have little quirks and tics and so on. And the point he's making is that those little quirks, those little tokens, stylistic tokens he calls them, reveal interesting and important moral dimensions of the speech and the speaker, and they add up again to this kind of image of the audience that the author is, or the speaker is formulating, right? So it's a kind of recruitment strategy, right? There's a kind of implicit image that is being created of who we want to be. And the audience steps into that image if they accept it, if they're those kinds of people. If not, then they reject, right? But it's in there. and it's this idea of the moreness of a discourse. Yeah, 111. He gets at this interesting disconnect between man and image. He says in the left column there toward the top, he says, we are more conscious that there may be a disparity between the man and his image, or the speaker and the actual person, right? The words and the source from which the words came. So we can never assume a direct one-to-one relationship between the words that are coming out of a speaker's mouth and that person. There's more. The speech carries a greater kind of symbolic payload than just the being of the speaker themselves, right? And he's saying that we, as kind of postmodern audience, viewer, member, just people walking around, we've become pretty suspicious. And this is, thinking like Watergate and like Vietnam and all that political craziness of the 60s. There was a lot of cynicism and skepticism on behalf of citizens about like who people really are and trusting, what they say and so on. This is sort of a question of trust. There's more to be sussed out in a given speech or text than it might at first seem. And the job of the critic is to sort of get at that more, that those tokens, those little indicators of, the world that this person's inhabiting. So he says, the next same column, we have learned to keep continuously before us the possibility, and in some cases the probability, the author implied by the discourse is an artificial creation, a persona, but not necessarily a person. So you can think of an implied speaker, right? It's like anytime someone gives a speech, they're implying a persona. This gets back to Aristotle's idea of ethos. It's like, who do I want you to think I am? There's an implied persona. Donald Trump's another good example. He has a very strong persona. Is that the same exact, representation as the man who goes to bed at night and, puts on his pajamas and who knows what kind of snack he has or whatever, right? But there's a persona that he conveys. And it's the persona, that kind of secondary image of the actual person, that Black wants to then transfer onto the audience. So we have the implied author, but now he wants to move into the implied auditor, which is the implied audience, right? That's the second persona. So he says this on the very next column right next to it. He says, what equally well solicits our attention is that there is a second persona also implied by a discourse, and that second persona is its implied auditor. So we've got author, speaker, auditor is audience. So the implied auditor, the implied audience, is the second persona. So anytime you think about when you watch just a commercial, and the commercial says something like, you're the kind of person who deserves, you're the kind of person who la 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 la, and then you're supposed to say, yeah, that's me. I'm that person. I have those values. I'm the kind of person who's always late and always, busy and so on. So I need that and I deserve that. This is what we're talking about. The implied image of the audience created by the text is that second persona, and it's a kind of almost like quiet or almost hidden secondary message, which is saying not just like, this is a good product, but you're the kind of person, right? You're it's flattery. It's a kind of broader sense of identity that's being offered here. So that's kind of it. Let's see. So 112, he gets into ideology on the top right column there. He says, especially we must note what is important in characterizing persona. It is not age or temperament or even discrete attitude. It is ideology. Ideology in the sense that Marx used the term. The network of interconnected convictions that function in a man epistemically. There's that epistemic thing. And that shapes his identity by determining how he views the world. So now put it all together. Talking about these stylistic tokens, these tics, these quirks that exist within a speech, they add up to a persona that's also like an identity. You're the kind of person who will understand what I'm saying, or you're the kind of person who won't, and I don't want to understand, right? There was much that was made when Barack Obama was president over the fact that he never used the language, never used the words radical Islamic terrorism. Remember this? he was just like raked over the coals by conservatives for not calling out by name radical Islamic terrorism. So he would say different things, right? And that's all stylistic stuff that actually gets at Obama's worldview and the sense of identity he inhabits. So when Obama's giving a speech and he's using different kind of language, or when Trump is using a speech and he's using very aggressive and sharp and pointed kind of language, when he's calling a spade or whatever, these are different kind of stylistic tokens that let audiences know I'm the kind of person who agrees or disagrees or whatever. But there's a persona that's being constructed in a kind of secondary way in the message, right? Now he also says here, let's see here, 16 minutes. All right, I gotta hurry. So this idea of ideology, right? Each tending to generate its own idiom, that sort of way of speaking. Of discourse, each tending to have decisive effects on the psychological character of its adherents, right? So a speech will contain an implied speaker, but it'll also contain an implied audience. And that audience is a sort of idealized version of who we are. So when he gets into this example of the cancer of communism, that's a stylistic kind of thing. But if you agree that communism is a cancer, then it comes with all these additional assumptions that add up to an ideology. In our own kind of context, you often hear, usually Republicans, usually conservatives, talk about tax relief. You ever heard of tax relief? The word relief is a kind of stylistic token of the person who's using that. The idea that taxes are such a kind of like an imprisonment. We need relief from this imprisonment. Liberals who are a lot more chill with taxes would not invoke the term tax relief, right? But when they say things like inclusion and so on, these are different kinds of stylistic tokens that, again, give certain attitudes that audiences are meant to kind of hook into. This is really a sort of a new way of thinking about the enthymematic quality of speeches that Aristotle talked about, which is like, what is assumed here? What am I trying to hook into in the audience? It's just that he's talking about a kind of stylistic imagery that's the kind of the accumulation of the speech, and it's this kind of second order vision that's being offered about who we are, what our identity is. And so this is important because it gets into the kind of the larger social, cultural, ideological effect of discourse, of speeches, of television shows. There's lots of codes. Today we hear lots of stuff about dog whistles and kind of, winky wink stuff, like all this kind of not, like hugely explicit, but still compelling rhetorical insinuation, crafting these images of who we want each other to be. This is the realm we're in here. All right, so this is getting a little long. I'll shut up. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. Otherwise, that's it for this week. Enjoy the readings, and I'll continue with the readings for next week. All right, gangs. Cheers.